And we're recording.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Hazmat Series Part 3, Highly Hazardous, Flammable, and Key Trains, brought to you by the Shortline Safety Institute and the American Shortline and Regional Railroad Association. My name is Sabrina Weiss. I'm the Vice President of Education and Business Development for the association. Before we begin, I want to let everyone know that we are recording this webinar and we will make the recording available to participants for a limited time, so you may go back and review anything we've discussed today. To ensure quality audio for the recording, all attendees are on mute and you will only be able to hear our presenters speaking. If you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the questions bar on your screen and we will read through all the submitted questions at the end of the webinar. I'll take a moment and introduce our presenters for today. J.R. Gellner is ASLRRA's Vice President of Safety and Compliance, and also with me is Michelle Malsky, the Safety Program Manager for the Shortline Safety Institute. Both of them are here with me now, and so I'm going to turn things over to J.R. to get us started.
Thank you, Sabrina. We appreciate everyone attending this webinar today, and we hope that you find it very educational. So we're going to start talking about key trains and what is a key train. So a key train is a train that has one tank car load of PIH or TIH, 20 car loads or intermodal portable tank loads of any combination of hazardous material, or one or more car loads of spent nuclear fuel or high-level radioactive waste. The exception is you do not count boxcars, trailers, or containers carrying mixed loads of hazardous material when determining a key train status. I want to say that this key train definition, these are considered best practices for the industry, and you will find these in the U.S. Instruction for Handling Hazmat by Rail, the latest edition that was released on June 30th of 2015. These are usually put together by the Hazmat Committee for the AAR, which the ASLRRA sits on that committee. These are placards of TIH that you're going to see possibly on a car that, or would be on a car that would cause it to be a key train. All right, you have restrictions for the operation of key trains. The maximum speed of a key train is going to be 50 miles per hour. And unless a siding or auxiliary track meets Class 2 standards, a key train will always hold the main track at meeting points or passing points when practical. Only cars equipped with roller bearings can be in a key train. And if a defect in a key train bearing is reported by a wayside detector, but a visual inspection fails to validate that defect, the train cannot exceed 30 mile per hour until it is passed over the next wayside detector or delivered to a terminal for mechanical inspection. If you pass it over the next detector and the same bearing is detected, then that train has to be set out, or that car has to be set out from the train immediately. And then you have key routes. And a key route is any track with a combination of 10,000 car loads of intermodal portable tank loads of hazmat material, or a combination of 4,000 car loads of PIH, TIH, and flammable gases, Class 1 and 2 explosives, Class 1.1 and 1.2 explosives, environmentally sensitive chemicals, spent nuclear fuel, and high-level radioactive waste over a period of 1 year. So you have two combinations there to look at whenever you're trying to determine if your railroad is a key route. And if you do have a key route, then there are key route requirements. You have to have wayside detectors placed at a maximum of 40 miles apart, or equivalent level of protection regarding bearings and hot wheels. A main track on a key route is inspected for rail defects and geometry car no less than 2 times each year, and sidings are similarly inspected at least once a year. And main tracks and sidings have to have periodic track inspections to verify cracks or breaks in joint bars. Any track used by meeting or passing key trains must be on a Class 2 or higher. If the meet or pass must occur on less than Class 2 track, then one of the trains must be stopped before the other train passes. So you can't have two trains passing each other if you have less than Class 2 track. Now, those key train recommendations are industry best practices. If you go into the CFR and try to look and find those rules, you will not find those rules. So it's not a regulation, it's an industry recommendation. Now we're going to talk about high hazard flammable trains and high hazard flammable unit trains. These trains are regulated through the CFR by the FRA and PHMSA. So we have new definitions in 171.8, which is your hazmat regulations of high hazard flammable trains. And HHFT is a single train transporting 20 or more loaded tank cars of Class 3 flammable liquid in a continuous block, or a single train that has 35 cars or more of the Class 3 flammable liquid throughout the train consist. And a high hazard flammable unit train means a single train transporting 70 or more loaded tank cars of Class 3 flammable liquids. These are some of the placards that are going to be associated with this type of trains. Primarily, we're talking about crude oil and ethanol trains. Now, we have new regulations in regard to high hazard flammable trains. High hazard flammable trains, you have to conduct a routing analysis as described in 172 subpart F. So before we did routing analysis on TIH, PIH, some nuclear fuels, and commodities that order. Now these flammable trains, if you have these certain amount of tank cars in your train, then you're going to have to do a routing analysis on the route that you traverse with those trains. Speed restrictions for these hazardous trains are going to be a maximum speed of 50 miles an hour or a maximum speed of 40 miles an hour within the limits of a high threat urban area if you don't have all of the tank cars that are meeting to the 117 standard. If you have a 111 car in that train and you go through a high threat urban area, then you're going to have to go at 40 miles an hour. And then you can find a list of the latest high threat urban areas. It's in 49 CFR 1580. And whenever this is available, you can see, you can click on that sub bullet and it'll take you to the link of where high threat urban areas are at. It doesn't always make a lot of sense based on population and stuff like that. There's some locations you would think would be a HTUA or not, and some that you wouldn't suspect are. So you need to go to that list and check that out to make sure, because this is mandated by regulation. So if you have an FRA inspector and you have a train that's a high hazard flammable train operating through an HTUA in excess of 40 miles an hour with a 111 in it, they can write a violation for that. So you have to be aware of that. There's a timeline on the analysis for the route of the high hazardous flammable trains. It should have been completed by March 31st of 2016. You can use data for the last half of July, or the last half of 2015, July 1 to December 31st. Or if you do have data for the entire year of 2015, you can use that data, but you have to indicate that in your analysis that you use data based on the entire year and not just half of the year. And we do have, there are some brake requirements for these type trains. So an HHFT operating in excess of 30 miles per hour has to be equipped with a two-way EOT, or there has to be distributed power within that train. So that's in the regulation. Regulation also had some requirements for ECP brakes on the HHFT unit trains. But the FAST Act that came out in December of 2015 stalled that regulation and required a study and justification by the Secretary of Transportation. The final aggregated timeline is December 4th of 2018 on that study being completed and the Secretary justifying the regulation that requires the ECP brakes. If it can't be justified, then that regulation will be repealed at that time. So we're still waiting to see on that as far as the ECP brakes. And we're going to talk a little bit about securement because we have securement requirements on these types of trains. So we have certain hazmat trains that cannot be left unattended on a main track or siding except when the main track or siding runs through or is directly adjacent to a yard, until the railroad has developed a securement plan that identify the specific locations that they are going to tie these trains up and leave them unattended. If you don't leave trains unattended with these certain types of commodities, you do not have to have a securement plan. But if for any reason you're going to leave these trains outside of a yard on a main line or on a designated siding, you are going to have a securement plan. And the process is to ensure that the train is properly secured. The plan is going to have to contain sufficient safety justification for the determination of leaving the equipment unattended, and the railroad must notify the FRA when a plan has been developed and put in place. Naturally, your employees are going to have to be trained on the plan and the processes of that plan. You do not have to send the plan to FRA for approval. You just have to notify them that there is a plan in place. They may turn around and promptly ask you to email them the plan so they can review it. They may not. It all depends on the FRA and what they really want to do. Now, the commodities that require the securement plans are any loaded tank car containing a PIH material, 20 or more loaded tank cars of or intermodal portable tanks of any kind, any one or combination of hazardous material, of TIH or 2.1 flammable gas, class 3 flammable liquids, which is really what we're talking about today, crude oil or ethanol, or combustible liquids, 1.1, 1.2 explosives, and other hazardous materials listed on this 173.31 F2, which you can go to the electronic CFR and look that up. It's probably 20 or so chemicals. They're pretty bad chemicals, so you need to verify that to make sure. Residues are not considered loads. So if you're moving crude oil trains, as long as it's not, if it's a residue train going back to the refinery or transloader or whatever the case may be, then the residues do not come under this. So you can tie up those residues without having to have a plan. Then we also have securement on requirements on locomotives that are moving these trains or connected to these trains. So if a freight train consisting of the previous commodities is left unattended on a main track or siding, the employee responsible for securing the equipment shall verify with another qualified person to ensure the equipment is secured in accordance with the railroad's processes and procedures. So you not only have to job brief, but if you're tying up a train of this nature outside or according to the securement plan, you have to make sure that you review that with a qualified person. It can't be just anybody. It has to be somebody that's qualified on the plan. And then the controlling locomotive of a train carrying these commodities has to be locked if it's capable of being locked. If it's not capable of being locked, the reverser on the controlling locomotive has to be removed from the control stand and placed in a secure location. Now, that FRA's looked at that secure location is a place that's locked up. So if you want to leave it in the locomotive, you're going to have it locked under lock and key inside the locomotive. You just can't hide it somewhere in the locomotive. They don't consider that secure. And then the exception for doing this with a locomotive is if the locomotive is not equipped with an operative lock, if the lock is broke, or the locomotive has a reverser that cannot be removed from its control stands. There are some locomotives still out there that you can't take the reverser out. Or if you have a reverser in here and you have to leave it in the locomotive to keep the locomotive idling in cold weather operations so it doesn't freeze. Also in this securement regulation is as of March 1 of 2017, so March of next year, each locomotive left unattended outside of a yard but not on a track directly adjacent to the yard shall be equipped with an operative exterior locking mechanism. So in other words, when you're tying up these locomotives, they're going to have locks on them come March 1, 2017. Now, a railroad may continue the use of a locomotive without an operative locking mechanism. However, if the controlling locomotive of a train consists of does not have an operative locking mechanism for the locomotive, the train must not be left unattended on the main track or siding unless the reverser is removed. And if it cannot be removed, you can get by doing that, and if you have to have it in there for cold weather operation, you can get by doing that. But you do have to try to, I would recommend that you try to get that lock fixed as quick as possible. They allow you to do that on your 92-day inspection, but I recommend that that's a high priority and you try to replace that locking device. So we also, the things we previously went over with on this securement and things of that nature were originally put forth, a lot of it in emergency order number 28, which was sunset when this regulation, this securement regulation came out, and the routing analysis and all of those regulations came out. Now, PHMSA still has an emergency order out for bulk and crude. And this emergency order requires each railroad carrier provide the State Emergency Response Commission, the SERC, not fusion centers, but the SERC, in each state of operation of movement notification of trains transporting more than 1 million gallons or more of bulk and crude through the counties in the state. But really, if you do the math on that, that's somewhere around 33 plus cars of crude oil. And then there was some explanation issued a couple of weeks after the emergency order came out that bulk and crude is going to be considered crude located within the Williston Basin of North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana in the United States, or Saskatchewan or Manitoba in Canada is bulk and crude oil. Now, this is not all crude oil, this is just bulk and crude oil. So if you got crude oil from coming out of West Texas or something like that, that's not considered bulk and crude oil, so you don't have to report this. I will note, though, that PHMSA is working on a final rule that will eventually sunset this EO, and they're looking at all crude oil, regardless of origin, being turned in whenever you're moving over 1 million gallons. So eventually that's probably going to include any crude oil that's moved around in the United States. And then you have, this is where some people really don't realize this, is you have a hazardous materials route definition that is in Part 213, your track safety standards. And that definition says that hazardous material routes means a track over which a minimum of 10,000 carloads or intermodal portable tanks of hazardous materials as defined in 49 CFR 171 travel over a period of 1 calendar year, or over which a minimum of 4,000 carloads. So you see the quantities are kind of the same, but the problem is not all of the commodities are the same. Because it talks about that loads of hazardous materials and commodities requiring a route analysis. So this definition you use whenever it pertains to regulated track inspection through 213, and the commodities that are involved, we're talking about Division 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3 explosives. We're talking about PIH in a single package. We're talking about highway route controlled quantities of Class 7 radioactive material, so any radioactive material, whether it's waste or anything like that. And you'll know number 4 is an HHFT train. So now flammable liquids have been recently thrown into the hazardous materials route used in 213. Now currently you only have to do these rail analysis, rail inspections on class 3 track or higher, but that is subject to change. So the confusing part about this, if you have key train definition that is really not regulated, it's industry best practices. Then you have a high hazardous flammable train and unit train definitions, which are regulated. And then you have this hazardous materials route, which is in the regulation, and it has a lot to do with how you're going to inspect your track and test your rail. So there's a lot of different regulations. Even though they sound kind of the same, they're not completely the same. And we'll talk a little bit about future regulation. I mentioned PHMSA on the reporting of crude oil movements. PHMSA is also working on a comprehensive oil spill plan that's underway. Comments are due the end of this month, and AAR and ASLRA are requesting the comment period be extended for 30 more days, but eventually we're going to have an oil spill plan regulation from PHMSA. FRA is also working on regulation for rail integrity, which includes headwear, and they're wanting to change the hazmat route to include class 2 track in that hazmat route. So if you're moving those large quantities of hazardous material that we just talked about on the other slide, if this regulation comes to pass, it will include testing for headwear and rail integrity on class 2 and higher track. And then we've got some of the same things in track safety standards going on, the same definition including class 2 track for geometry testing. Right now they're proposing geometry testing once every quarter, which is even more so than what is the industry practice recommendation in the key train routes. So this is something that the Shoreline Association is working on. We attend these RSAC meetings, but with the attention being paid to hazmat and hazmat routes and key routes and high hazard flammable trains and all of these different things, a lot of these routes that are moving higher quantities of hazmat are going to have changes in the way they do their track inspection and their rail inspection, and it's going to go down to a lower class of track than what has previously been the case. That's just my opinion, but there's not a lot of support within FRA or publicly to not include these hazmat routes. So something to be aware of in the future. And that concludes my part of the presentation, and I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Thanks, JR. So just a quick note, our next webinar is going to be next week, September 27th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Just make note that it's 3 p.m. and not 2 as we normally do it. It'll be at 3 p.m. September 27th. And this is going to go over the nuts and bolts of car inspections. What does it look like on a deeper dive into tank cars? What are you actually looking for? Where are some detailed pictures and examples? And we're gonna walk you through that. And then we're also going to get into some of the other cars that you deal with on an everyday basis. And we'll go over some of the common errors as well so we can avoid them in the future. And that presentation will be with Ron Hines, the Shoreline Safety Institute Executive Director, and myself, Michelle Malsky, the Safety Program Manager. So make sure you sign up for that. Seats are going quick, and we look forward to seeing you then.
Okay, so I will step in here and remind folks that if you have questions for JR about today's presentation, please go ahead and type them into your questions bar there on your screen. I've received a few here that we'll go through, but first I'm going to ask JR to advance his slide 1 so that if folks have questions after this, or if you want to reach out to JR directly or reach out to Michelle directly, their contact information is right here on your screen, so you can just jot those down. Okay, so our first question is, can you repeat where to find the definitions again?
Well, the key train definitions are going to be in the U.S. instructions for handling hazmat by rail. Latest edition was released June the 30th of 2015. If you do not have that, you can email me a request for that. I've got I've got it on my computer and I can send it to you. The one hazmat route regarding track inspection is going to be in 49 CFR 213. In the presentation gives you the exact location. I can't remember that off the top of my head. And then the high hazardous flammable routes are going to be in, I believe, 172. 49 CFR are going to be in 172 and 174 in the definition sections. And if you have trouble finding them or whatever, just reach out to me. I can look them up and I can email you a link that can take you straight to them.
Perfect. And I'll remind folks that because this presentation is coming from the Shortline Safety Institute, we typically make the PowerPoint available to anyone requesting it. So if you would like a copy of the PowerPoint and those embedded links that you can easily get to the websites from the presentation, just go ahead and send Michelle an email and she can send you a copy of the presentation. Which addresses our next question, which is, can we get a copy of the PowerPoint? So that's good. And it is available, and just go ahead and email Michelle and let her know that you'd like a copy of it. Okay, a couple more questions here. So one of the slides you said on the slide itself, it said the routing analysis as described in 172 subpart I was on the slide, but you said subpart F.
I'm wrong. It's I.
Okay.
It's 172I, so I misspoke.
That's fine.
I'm sorry.
That's fine. We just needed clarification on that, so we're good there. Another question we have is, what is a designated siding? What would that look like?
Well, a designated siding is up to the railroad. If you can in your timetable, special instructions, or in your general timetable instructions, you will designate what a siding is. And a siding requires you to do more frequent track inspections, where you're going to be meeting and passing trains all the time. The railroad has an option to not designate any sidings, because sidings require that you inspect them at a minimum once a week. You can designate your side tracks as simply side tracks, passing tracks, yard tracks, and then you only have to inspect them once every 30 days. So if you don't have anything designated as a siding, then you probably don't have any sidings. It's really up to the railroad designation.
Okay. Looks like we've got just one more question, so we'll wrap it up after this unless anybody else puts something in here. The last question is, what is required for securing a locomotive? Would any kind of exterior lock work?
Any kind of exterior lock. AAR has, because they share locomotives back and forth between roads, have a standard lock that they're using and a locking device. So it's easier for them whenever they're transferring a train from if BN gives a train to UP, that kind of thing. There's a lot of short lines out there that have just a regular old hasp on the door and use some type of a switch lock or even a master lock. Any kind of locking device is acceptable. The FRA does not have specifications, or the regulation doesn't require a specific type of lock.
Excellent. Thanks so much for covering all those questions, JR. And I'll remind folks, if you think of anything afterwards, feel free to reach out to JR directly by email or give him a call, and he can answer any more questions that you might have. That covers everything we have for today. Again, feel free to go ahead and register for next week's webinar. Online registration is open, so go ahead and after you jump off of this webinar, jump on our website and put your name in line. I want to thank everybody again today. Thank you, JR. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks, everybody, for participating, and everyone have a great afternoon.